For a long time, I struggled to get my images perfectly exposed. I went from letting my camera decide to going full manual and watching my histogram very closely. I studied different techniques, but I didn't really improve. I still had moments of disappointment when I got my photos home and I took a close look at them and I saw that I was missing details in my highlights and my shadows. Finally, I came upon the setup that I have now, which I'm going to share with you today, in the hopes that you can avoid the time that I wasted figuring out how to get perfect exposure every time. But let's start by framing the question, what is exposure and how do I get perfect exposure in my images? It's good to think about exposure as the amount of light that your camera detected while you were taking an image. Too little light and it's like a pitch black night. Too much and it's like staring into the sun. And just like our eyes, cameras don't see well in the pitch black or when we stare into a bright light. We begin to lose details as the light in the dark washes out into one shade. So there are 4 tools that I use in combination when getting my exposure perfect. The first I'll start with is metering mode. And what this does is it tells the camera where exactly to look in the image to figure out how it should expose that image. For things like portraits, you might want that to be exposed in the center to make sure that someone's face is perfectly exposed. For me, I like to do an entire screen average as I mostly do landscape photography and I want to make sure that every pixel is properly exposed. But you have some options. You can do, in this case, highlights, entire screen, which I like, some sort of spot, either small or large, center weighted, or multiple different places. So the next tool that I use is a histogram. And I make sure that this is part of my display cycle. I like to customize my camera settings quite a lot, and I have a few different things that I have when I click on my display button that cycle through. Things like a level, I like to take all the tools off the screen from sometimes, and one of the things I make sure is always there is the histogram, which shows up in the bottom right-hand corner and shows me a distribution of all of the different levels of light that my sensor is currently grabbing. The next tool that I use is something called zebra display. Now, this is traditionally a videography tool, but it's excellent for photography because you can use it to show you where in your image the highlights are clipping. I set a particularly custom setting on this in that I like to have my display level at lower limit 105+. The next tool that I use is my exposure compensation wheel. I'm typically shooting in aperture priority mode, and so the camera will give me an exposure it thinks it's correct, and I can adjust up and down from there. So with our metering, histogram, zebra display, and using our exposure compensation wheel, let's head out in the field and put these tools to use.
Ooh, this might be nice. This might be very nice. Well, I'm here at the Scarborough Bluffs just before sunrise, and I think this is going to be a perfect scene to show off different exposure techniques. And the reason for that is that there really isn't a single cloud in the sky to diffuse the sun, and that means that there's going to be sunlight directly coming into my camera lens, and the composition that I've chosen has a lot of foreground elements. There will be some water that will reflect the sun, as well as a lot of dark sand, which has a lot of detail in it, and I'm hoping that I won't lose that detail by underexposing my image. So let's put our exposure tools to use. So first of all, I'm using aperture priority mode, which means I'm going to be using my exposure compensation dial to adjust away from the automatic exposure that the camera is suggesting. And let me bring up my histogram, which I had set up earlier. And as you can see, there's a spike all the way to the left side of this, meaning that some of these areas are likely just at the bottom of their exposure. And if I were to go down at all, I would underexpose them. Really, I'm looking to avoid a spike right at the bottom and right at the top of the histogram. Normally when I'm looking to expose an image, I will usually start by bringing up the histogram until I can see a little bit of zebra display. Now, this part right here, the sun is just beginning to peek over the clouds, so this is going to get quite a lot brighter. I want to make sure that I don't have any zebra display on my screen at all, except for exactly where the sun is. The sun's never going to have any detail and it's going to be extremely bright and you're never going to be able to pull that back. And so I'm okay if the sun has a little bit of zebra display. That's not going to bother me. As the sun continues to rise, more and more parts of the scene will begin to light up. They will begin reflecting light into my camera lens, and they will start showing up with zebra display, hot spots on the lens of things that are picking up slightly too much light. So as the sun rises here, I'm going to change my exposure just a little bit to show off some of the things that will begin to be overexposed and some of the things that will begin to be underexposed. With this, at an additional +2 on my exposure compensation. I have most of my foreground is quite bright, but also almost my entire sky and a little bit of my midground is also too bright. This is going to be overexposed if I were to take this image. A lot of white pixels that I can't pull back and I can't get detail from. If I take this down the other way, well, I'll end up with no zebra display. My histogram will begin showing a little bit of spike off to the left, which is also not good because it means I'm going to have underexposed pixels in my scene. So as you can see in my shot review, it's also blinking over the sun, showing me that that area of the image is far too exposed. That's not going to be a problem, as I mentioned, but I can adjust for that as much as possible. I think I'll go ahead and take 2 images so that I can raise the blacks of this image, lower the highlights down, and do a bracketed image that's going to allow for more dynamic range overall. For the first image of this bracket, I'm going to be taking my exposure compensation up to plus 0.7, which, while the sun and the sky will be much overexposed, that'll be okay because I can pull back that detail with my underexposed image. For that image, I think I'm going to go all the way to -1, 3 stops of light under here, and that gives me only the sun, okay, minus 1.3, that just gives me the sun and a little bit of the water is overexposed. So with that, I can see there are parts of the image that are far too black, but again, that's okay because I have another image that I can layer over top of that to pull back that detail. All right, well, let's head back to the studio and see how it turned out.
Well, here we are a few days later, and I'm ready to review the images I got at the Scarborough Bluffs. I have taken 3 images, one divider to show the difference here. The first image I took was 1 exposure, exposing for both the sky and the ground, the highlights and the shadows. The next 2 that I took were 1 image where I overexposed to try to get more detail in the shadows, and I took another image after that to underexpose to get more detail in the sky. And in Lightroom, I've got one tool in the histogram that I can turn on that shows where in this image the photo has been under or overexposed. And actually, this first image is really quite good. There's only a small spot on this side and a little trail of spots on this side that are underexposed. And then coming up to the sun, you can see just the sun is overexposed in this one image. And I'm sure if I were to change the exposure a little bit, I can see that I can bring up detail in the bottom of this image, the dark part of this image, and I can get quite a lot of detail out of the sky, which interestingly has a little bit of a sunburst on it, which might be something that I want to bring into this photo. It's a nice element. On the other 2 images, you can see this one that is overexposed has a lot less. Still, it's not a big portion of the frame, but it does have a lot less underexposure in this little area here, and only a couple of small dots in this little area over here that was quite dark. But in the underexposed image, I've got quite a lot of pieces that are underexposed in this section over here and in this little trail of pieces over here. All 3 of these images, I'm sure, are fine, and I will be able to pull detail out of all of those. But for the sake of showing you what I would do with a very underexposed image, I'll show you the blending technique that I will do with these 2 images here. But first, let's start with the single exposure. I can begin editing this image simply probably by bringing down the sky a little bit, as what I want is a contrast in this area between sort of the sun's peeking over the horizon and these sort of dark edges. Gives a little bit of vignetting and helps the viewer kind of focus in on that sun. It also, introduces quite a lot more color. And if I were to bring this up, all you would get is a small kind of yellow-orange band here, and then mostly just white at the top. So if I bring that down, I'll be able to get a little bit of interest in the sky, but I'm now introducing more underexposed pieces inside this image. So to compensate for that, I can bring up the shadows, which will expose a little bit more of this foreground. And for this particular image, I really want to only bring out a little bit of detail, because what I really like about it is that the sun is reflecting off of the elements right in the center, and I'll probably end up cropping out a big portion of the left and the right of this frame so that I only have
interesting detail where the sun is hitting it, where it's creating a little bit of visual interest, and it leads up to the sky that has this sort of, maybe halo effect of the sun only illuminating parts of the sky. I also have the option to bring up my blacks, but bringing up your blacks will change some of the way that your whites look, change some of the way that the sky looks. And as you can see, as I bring the blacks up, it removes a bit of the color difference, a bit of the color contrast that's in the portions in the top left and the top right. I'm also going to change the temperature of this a little and probably introduce a few other different elements. But before I do that, let's move on to these two other images to show how I can blend them together. With these two images, there's quite a lot of difference between the way that they look. And the first thing that I need to do is make them match a little bit. And what I mean by that is that I probably need to bring the exposure of the underexposed image up. And then what I'll need to do is take the exposure of the brighter image down. And what I'm hoping to do is make them match. And I can do that by looking at the little previews that are produced in Lightroom, and I can kind of take a look at how they look. I can also take a look at the histogram and flip back and forth between the two images and see that they are very similar. What I'll do is select both of those images and go edit in, and I want to open as layers in Photoshop. And this will take a minute as it renders both of these images and gets them ready to be pushed into Photoshop. So I'm going to select both of these images using Shift in Photoshop, and then I'm going to go to Edit and Auto Align Layers. The Auto Align tool gives you a few different options, but I'm just going to stick with the Auto, and I'll let that align these layers. And all that does is it tries to match up the visual elements and lines in your photos, and you can see afterwards if this is done properly. Typically there will be some clear kind of hashing area around the photo. And this is where the images, of course, didn't line up perfectly, so resized them, maybe reoriented them a little bit in order to make them align perfectly. The piece that I'll do next is select the top image. Again, this is the image that's going to have the sky and the sun. And holding down my Option key on a Mac, I'm going to click this Add Layer Mask button down here, which adds a black layer mask to this and makes it invisible on top of the other image. I then very quickly with a paintbrush can go and draw back in this image, but since I only want the top, all I need to do is select my white color so that I know that I'm painting in white, and then I can slowly paint in where the image is, usually by selecting around where my focus point would have been. And then afterwards, I can hit Option to go and take a look at the mask, and I can fill in any parts that maybe I didn't get. Okay, now what this has done is it's created a bit of a blend of two images, or really just one layer on top of another. But the magic really happens when I bring these two images together, and what I can do is ask for it to merge layers, which will bring that down into one image. And now what I really have here is I've got one image that was both of those images stacked on top of each other. In theory, I've got my focus point also in the foreground and then in the background, but more importantly, I've now got more data in the sky and more data in the foreground in order to make sure that I've got the maximum amount of dynamic range and I can get my exposure perfect. And I'll continue to edit this image and show you the result.